Hi. So, obviously, this is a complete 180 compared to the kinds of content I usually upload on YouTube, WordPress, or the various sim racing websites I've written for over the years. But I figured there was no better day than today to do a proper face reveal and say that, yes, this is the Austin Oganowski behind PretendRaceCars.net. This humble little office here was responsible for the most divisive and polarizing website ever created for sim racing. I'm here today doing a face reveal and dressed in all black and all fancy because I think there's something we really need to talk about with regards to where the sim racing industry and the sim racing hobby is going over the next 3, 5, even 10 years. As a former content creator, as someone who just enjoyed these games on a consumer level, and as someone who at one point was doing contract work for a major sim racing developer, I've noticed that we need to take a very hard look at ourselves and ask ourselves what's going on with sim racing, and in particular, what is going on with our favorite developers. It is my personal opinion that developers are really starting to lose the plot in this hobby, and it's making this whole hobby not fun to participate in, which is ridiculous because we should be happy to go sim racing after work each day, and we should be happy to engage in the forums, and we should be happy that developers are really just a few clicks away, and instead the opposite is happening. Sim racing's running into two really big issues that I feel we need to address and take a pretty good, intricate look at, because what's going on right now in this scene, in this hobby, in this industry, has the potential to derail absolutely everything we've worked towards over the past 25 years, from Indianapolis 500, the simulation, to the more modern stuff like Assetto Corsa Competizione. It's my personal opinion that most of the major developers in this scene are starting to lose the plot. They are no longer able to regularly deliver on their promises of an accurate and authentic racing simulator, especially after all this time, resources, and research put into it. They are still spinning their wheels in the mud. And developers are also having a really tough time just respecting their customers on a base level, and that can extend to anyone from just base customers, content creators, and even professional drivers. And it's resulting in a very ugly and bizarre scene that is getting increasingly harder and harder to recommend to friends, family members, or even fellow amateur professional drivers. So let's start things off by talking about my favorite personal topic, and that is car handling. So if we think back 20 years ago to the release of games like Grand Prix Legends, NASCAR 4, or Richard Burns Rally, we all sort of understood that developers wouldn't quite get it right. We all kind of understood that, yeah, Grand Prix Legends is a little too difficult, or NASCAR Racing 4 is a little too slippy, or you can have these really exaggerated yaw angles in the default Richard Burns Rally. And we understood that because this hobby, this industry, this technology was still relatively brand new. All these developers responsible for these games were really venturing out into the unknown, and as consumers, we understood that anytime you bought a new sim, you would 100% have to understand and learn and practice what each physics engine wanted from you. And we did that in good faith that 5, 10, or 15 years down the road, even 20 years down the road, these growing pains of racing sims not quite handling right, those would be a thing of the past. However, I don't know if some of you have looked at the calendar on your desktop or on your wall, but it's now 2021. We really are in the future of sim racing, and yet these handling gremlins are still a problem. Every time a new sim is released, every time a new piece of DLC released, every time an update's released, it is Groundhog Day. There are still some cars that are okay, and some cars that completely missed the mark. It feels like we are reliving 2001 or 2004 over and over again, which is bizarre because, as what's this from, RoboCop? We have the technology now. We have an abundance of professional drivers willing to give feedback. We have tons of well-written sim racers being able to explain precisely what is wrong with some cars, and yet almost every major or even minor release in the sim racing scene results in a few cars that are passable at best, a few cars that are okay or even good, and then cars that are just flat out undrivable. It feels like these companies are wasting your time at this point, because some of us have actually been playing these games for 15 or 20 years, and we held out for a future in which this wasn't an occurrence anymore, and yet it still is. And some of the guys I would sit on TeamSpeak with years ago, waiting around for a future update, waiting around for a patch, waiting around for the next edition of a game to rectify some of the handling issues in iRacing, in Project Cars, in Race Room, in Assetto Corsa. Those updates never came. And the guys I would hang out with and daydream about what it would be like when the next update came, they went to university. They had kids. They bought houses. They sold all their stuff. And these games still aren't ready for us.
Now we are pretty much driving on pavement. You can just smash the throttle out of the corner, no wheel spin. You can't even pitch the car. So disappointing. And of course I'm slow as hell because nothing of this makes sense, so you have to figure out how to drive it like a game instead of common sense dirt racing.
Furthermore, when professional drivers such as Nicky Team or Danny Juncadella attempt to reach out to some of these companies and say, we are willing to help you free of charge because we love your game so much, their emails go unanswered. At this point, it's hard to argue anything other than these developers are beginning to waste a lot of people's time, and a lot of people are going to start leaving. However, as much as I'd like to sit here and just rattle on about tire models all day, or handling exploits, or physics exploits, or setup exploits, and make that kind of sim racing content and turn it into one of those videos, I can't do that because there's a much bigger pressing issue at hand, and it really can derail the entire industry. Behind the scenes, a lot of our major developers and major players in this industry are extremely petty, extremely rude, and extremely disrespectful to their customers, to other developers, and even professional drivers who take time out of their busy schedule to promote and play and give feedback on these games. If this behavior continues, we're going to run into situations where relationships with the brands and investors that help keep sim racing afloat are going to be permanently damaged, and professional drivers will put a lot of effort into warning people and those inside the motorsports industry to stay away from sim racing for good. What's really bothersome is that there are examples of this kind of behavior spanning every major developer in the scene. This is not something that is relegated to just one loose cannon on one development team. There is a culture of toxicity within the sim racing industry, and it's not perpetuated by the players. Nobody's being sexist. Nobody's being racist. It's instead the developers themselves who are completely off the rails, completely egotistical, downright petty, and in some moments absolutely absurd. So we'll start with Assetto Corsa, which ironically, outside of all of my criticisms levied against it, it is my most played racing simulator over the past 3 or 4 years. So I believe in either 2016 or 2017, there was a Norwegian stunt driver by the name of Fredrik Sorli, who was a massive sim racer and was big into actually modding the game, making his own tires, his own car, trying to replicate his drift cars. And he had written to Assetto Corsa staff member at the time, Stefano Casillo, saying, hey, I've made this unique way of making street tires in your game, and I would just like some feedback on it, because I think I've uncovered something really interesting, and to me, as a professional stunt driver and a driving instructor, it feels quite nice. Stefano responded in all caps, telling him to read a fucking book before berating him over this extremely long exchange of text messages in the game's official forums, and Fredrik was so distraught that he ended up making a post about it on his official Facebook page, saying, oh my god, the guy that develops Assetto Corsa is fucking psycho. Back in 2016, when I was in the midst of running Pretend Race Cars as a website, I had this little functionality on the side where you could contact my personal email and just submit a story. And the intention of that was for some of the guys who were really big into arcade racers or just games I didn't play to send in little tips or just happenings in their own scene. For example, there's a huge culture around GTA Online racing. I didn't play it, I didn't cover that. There's a huge culture around Need for Speed with tons of their own YouTube commenters and Twitch streamers. I didn't play Need for Speed at the time. That was a way for people to keep me up to date on what was going on in that community. Instead, I would receive emails such as this one from Klaus Wolfharth, who is the head of KW Suspensions, praising me for my articles written about Slightly Mad Studios and the botched release of Project Cars. And Klaus went on to go talk about some of the shady dealings he had dealt with Ian Bell and that kind of organization behind the scenes over the years, and how they cut and ran and basically just said a bunch of shit he probably shouldn't have. And when I pressed him for more details and said, like, look, like, I guess there's probably a story here, but you need to actually show me something physical, like a document or like something floating around in like an archive or like an online legal archive of some sort, he suddenly couldn't provide me with anything and left me alone. Why would you ever send this email? Codemasters is actually a really upsetting one to talk about, as I'm personally involved in this one. Obviously, you guys know about a year to a year and a half ago, Codemasters acquired Slightly Mad Studios, and it was seen as a really big win for just sim racing overall, because you're essentially combining two companies into a super team. So Ian Bell had hit me up around the time the deal was finalized and said that I actually almost got terminated during the, I guess, negotiations for this deal for the sole reason that Codemasters just didn't like me. I had not met anyone from Codemasters. I didn't even know anyone there. I had never had contact with even like so much as their social media guy. That's how kind of off in left field I wasn't a content creator. And I was being told that I could have probably lost my job during this acquisition. And the only reason I hadn't is that Ian had actually gone through my YouTube channel, which is really just my personal channel where I upload hot laps and commentary vids and just whatever, and found, I guess, Grid Autosport and Dirt 3 videos from years ago that I had just uploaded on a whim, really, like we all do with our YouTube channels, and used that as justification for me to stay on board as the company was bought by Codemasters. So imagine going to work and finding out that the quality of your work doesn't actually matter, and what saved your job, last year during a major transition for the company was a Dirt 3 hot lap you'd uploaded 4 years ago when you were stoned out of your mind. And then go to work the next day and try not to let that bother you. Next, we get to iRacing, which partakes in this behavior quite frequently, which is very upsetting because they're the ambassadors of sim racing to the rest of the world and the motorsports scene. We'll start with their sporting code, which is just their basic kind of manual or rules package for all users to abide by when racing on the service. And very early on in section 2.1.1.1, I think that's it, there's a rule that essentially says persistent negativity or criticism of the game is not allowed. Why would you ever put something this draconian in print? I thought video games were supposed to be fun. I thought sim racing was supposed to be fun, and you've made a rule that makes it against the game's rules to criticize or make negative comments about the game frequently, which in some cases might actually be needed. Sometimes if a developer doesn't get something right for several builds in a row, sometimes you actually need to tell them, but iRacing have actually made it against their rules. Which, again, I don't know why you'd ever write something like that. This comes across as just overly paranoid. Moving on, in 2013, when I was writing sporadically for Race Department, who at the time was under the control of a guy named Bram Hengeveld, I think I pronounced that right, I had done a fairly long and detailed iRacing review. We figured it would drive up traffic to the site and get people talking and engaging in the forums and engaging in discussion. And because the game was, on the market for 4 or 5 years, it was probably time for one of the big sites to actually, take a stab at reviewing the game. And I did give it a mostly positive score and mostly positive comments. I gave it a 7 out of 10, and I praised the organization, safety rating, the iRating functionality, the oval racing, but I did say that the tire model definitely needs work, especially in the road racing cars, which was a pretty commonly held opinion back then. Within a day or two, Tony Gardner from iRacing actually sent Graham an email saying this 7 out of 10 mostly positive review was actually slanderous, and wanted me either removed from the website or the article taken down. Just sitting there as a young kid in his early 20s, seeing a major sim developer label a mostly positive review as slanderous and as part of a vendetta, when most people in the comment section actually agreed and said it was a well-written review, was just really mind-blowing. And I remember telling people and some of my friends in the sim community about this, and they too were shocked until 7 years later when iRacing had sent Scott Dixon almost the same email word for word, supposedly.
So speaking with someone at IndyCar today, and was told that the next time a driver wants to say something critical of iRacing or say that it isn't feeling exactly like an IndyCar, please let us know first, because apparently some folks there didn't like Scott Dixon's comments about, hey, it's not real, and I'm not really being able to jive with it.
iRacing's pattern of behavior, this sending out individuals emails, making these very subtle legal threats towards them for criticizing their game, this just continued. In 2017, when I was doing contract work for Slightly Mad Studios, for the first year, I was still running my website, Pretend Race Cars. So I would work on the game, which at the time was Project Cars 2, during the day, and then I would write articles in the afternoon. And that was just how I spent my time. So in late 2017, the iRacing Rallycross content was first released, and one of my buddies in the scene, a guy by the name of Dan Roper, who's a pretty well-respected esports driver, said, "Hey Austin, the Rallycross content came out today. It's traction rolling, and it's just not so great. And like, I'll give you my login and all that, and you can just go turn laps on it and make content for your site, because like it would be nice for someone to get the word out there that, hey, maybe hold off on this stuff for a bit." So I did. I logged in as Dan Roper. I turned a few laps, and within minutes reproed the traction rolling issue. It really wasn't all that difficult at the time. Just that's how the tires were. iRacing sent off another email, kind of hinting at legal action. This time to Slightly Mad Studios. So this company, or at least certain individuals in this company, seem to be just excessively paranoid of any sort of criticism, and it's made me wonder over the past decade how much of the content you see about iRacing, whether it be on YouTube or Twitch or the various sim racing hobbyist websites, is genuine. Do people genuinely enjoy this game, or did they dare write one somewhat negative article about iRacing and receive either legal threats or strongly worded emails, and were essentially bullied and harassed into never criticizing the game? I want to say explicitly that I'm not here to leak info about upcoming games or spill inside company secrets in regards to just the day-to-day operations. Not going to do that. Anyone who wants that can eat a dick. What I'm going to do instead is just give you examples as they pertain to SMS that are in line with the other examples I've already talked about up to this point. So I can't remember precisely if it was before I started doing contract work for Slightly Mad Studios or afterwards, but Ian Bell had approached me in regards to some articles that were on Pretend Race Cars. These were articles showing how Ian had gone into, I believe, either the official SMS forums or race department or both, and very aggressively lipped off customers who were unsatisfied with either Project Cars 1 or Project Cars 2. It sounds like Project Cars 1, given this was early 2017. And I had just done an article on it saying it was, flat out unacceptable. Ian had approached me and said these 3 articles I had done on just his form antics, which everyone knew were unacceptable and had been profiled by other websites, and said that investors had come into a meeting with these articles printed out and cost the company a lot of money, and that to prevent something like that from happening again to SMS, he would send me a brand new top-of-the-line gaming PC in exchange for pulling the articles down. If this sounds like a bribe, you are correct. and within a couple weeks I had a brand new Alienware PC on my front doorstep for personal use. Had no strings attached to the company. It was just a gift for pulling down articles and doing social media damage control, because apparently it was easier to simply send someone a top-of-the-line gaming PC than actually take responsibility for writing, dickish forum comments to your customers. In late 2017, this was just a few months after the release of Project Cars 2, more and more real drivers were starting to get into this hobby. It was late 2017. It was starting to do the rounds on social media, people buying sim rigs. Guys were getting into it really big. So there was a European GT3 driver by the name of, I believe it's Jan Seyfarth. I hope I got that name right. Who had done a very basic comparison video of him driving laps at Nürburgring in 3 different games. I want to say it was Race Room, Project Cars 2 obviously, and maybe either iRacing or Assetto Corsa. And he had just simply said the Project Cars 2 ring in terms of accuracy and track mesh just ranked last. That's all he said. The guy didn't disparage the company or anything. Ian proceeded to supposedly contact Total Wolf, who is a very important person, as you may know, in the Mercedes F1 camp, to complain about this and rant that this violated a non-disparagement agreement. So, Jan, if you happen to see this video, which there's like a 5% chance you will, I want to personally apologize. I do not condone this behavior. This is excessively petty, unacceptable, and I'm sorry if you, in your professional life, you suffered any repercussions from this. It is completely ridiculous for these companies to be this paranoid about criticisms of their product, especially when it was so unbelievably mild. Jan, I'm extremely sorry. Now, for some of you who are familiar with the iRacing community side of things, obviously over the past year, you have learned fairly quickly that a former comrade of Dale Earnhardt Jr.'s back way in the NASCAR 03 days, a guy by the name of Jason Jacoby, has suffered some sort of intense psychotic break after years of rumors of instability and behavior that was not acceptable.
I will not let any of you rest until I see Joni Axon be killed for what she's done.
In some of his videos, especially earlier in 2021, Jason had mentioned that he had been writing to Slightly Mad Studios in an attempt to get me fired, blaming me for a suicide attempt that I didn't even know about.
Found out though that he works for Project Cars or Slightly Mad Studios, and I'll be reaching out. I've already sent a phone call to try to get him canned from there.
As he learned that there were multiple companies involved with Slightly Mad Studios, for example, the Codemasters acquisition and then the EA acquisition quite recently, Jacoby would continue to contact these companies or the HR departments of these companies with these very elaborate rantings saying that I had destroyed his life, ruined his dreams, caused him to try and commit suicide, and I guess blame me for his girlfriend leaving him.
Yeah, congratulations, Austin. You brought me to a breakdown and my life to ruins, and now I can sincerely say I hope the same for you.
Everyone who watches this guy's YouTube uploads, such as the one where he threatens to kill his middle school teacher, very quickly deduce that this man is insane and you should probably not listen to him. Our HR department and then EA's HR department did not feel the same way, and instead spent 3 months investigating something that sim racers around the world figured out in 15 seconds.
Get your fucking brain in order!
As we began work on the very early stages of Project Cars 4, I would have to go into work every single day wondering if I had a job or not. I did my part and provided HR with a mountain of evidence and online screenshots of this guy's very obvious descent into insanity that had been brewing for several years, and I thought things were going to be okay. I had saved so much and had the support from his ex-girlfriend, who was willing to send me everything from court records to reference numbers for some of the sergeants she had been dealing with in relation to him stalking her. And she was completely open, so thank you, Mackenzie, for doing that. And I supplied everyone who asked for it with an SMS and EA as much info as I could about this. I believed that this was a pretty open and shut situation, and I was assured by my immediate coworkers that this could pretty easily have been dealt with in 5 to 10 minutes, and there was voices in the company who wanted it dealt with that way and knew exactly what they were looking at. Instead, the investigation continued for, as I mentioned, months on end, and I would go into work every single day wondering if I had a job or not. This was further amplified when I received a phone call from Ian Bell in the middle of the night when I was actually getting ready for bed, who confessed to me that the company wanted to fire me.
You gotta defend yourself. This telephone conversation never happened. I want you to respect that, please. Don't ever say that I called you up and pre-warned you, because they want to sack you.
HR was lazy and didn't even really look into who this guy was and just took his claims at face value because they were lazy.
So what's their, like, I'm kind of hurt that they didn't investigate into this and look at the guy's videos and see, like, this guy's going on about his middle school teacher at 30 years old and see that, this, like...
Because they're lazy.
And then proceeded to rattle off the various mental illnesses he thought I had.
You're really low on the spectrum of each of those. When I say low on the spectrum, I mean probably below me, because I'm more fucked up than you are. That's the truth. And that's about it, mate. That's what you got.
From this point forward, the HR meetings I'd be subjected to, I would say every 3 to 4 weeks, became increasingly more bizarre, and I distinctly remember the very strange questions that would be asked of me. For example, back when I had my Pretend Race Cars website up, I had written articles cautioning people not to donate to any of Jason Jacoby's crowdfunding campaigns because he very obviously did not manage his money properly and was essentially trying to scam people. I was told this wasn't any of my business and I should have just let others blow their money on dumb GoFundMe scams however they want, which I found was a very strange stance for HR to take. I was then asked why I felt the need to warn the sim racing community about a harasser and potentially a predator, and why I would feel that was any of my business, and found myself having to jump through hoops to explain basic human decency as a concept to another fully grown man. When I mentioned to our HR department the call Ian Bell had made towards me that made me believe I was going to be fired regardless, and that I was essentially being subjected to a kangaroo court, instead of apologizing or saying this is not right, or that this instilled a fear in me that was not justified, HR began asking me if I could delete the video.
It's been explained to me that I think you shared the full conversation between yourself and Ian Bell.
Yep.
With Annie as part of the investigation.
Yep.
I've been asked to say that obviously that's a private conversation, and sharing this recording is not appropriate because it wasn't taken with consent. And I've been asked that you take steps to remove it from wherever it's located. I believe that may be YouTube.
Upon the conclusion of the investigation, which again took 3.5 months to deduce something that the majority of the sim community figured out in anywhere from 15 to 30 seconds or an afternoon of merely cruising Jacoby's profile, I was told that I was harassing Jacoby for making these videos warning the community about him, and that my services were no longer needed, that my behavior did not fall in line with the values of both Codemasters and SMS, and my contract would not be renewed, which is today. I fully understand that over the years there are a lot of people who like my content, but there are also a lot of people who don't like my content. They believe I'm overly cynical, negative, and critical of racing sims. I think you now understand a bit of where I'm coming from. I have seen this kind of behavior from developers play out really over the past decade with no end in sight, and it has gotten progressively crazier as time has gone on. This is what fuels my very love-hate relationship with sim racing and makes me concerned about where this industry and this hobby is headed. If you continue to act like this, if developers continue to get in these very bizarre spats, they have these little meltdowns over DMs, we're going to start ruining relationships with the various companies and the products and the brands and the drivers that have helped build sim racing into what it is today. As an amateur racer who competes around Alberta and BC, and just being the young guy that I am, often a lot of times when there's no activity in the pits or during intermission or in between sessions, guys will shoot the shit with me about sim racing and whether they should get into it, whether they should take up the hobby, how to get into it, how much does it cost, what the best games are for the PC or the consoles. What do you think I tell these people? I really want you to ask yourselves that. After everything I've outlined in this video so far, from the developers still struggling to get physics right after 20 years, for the developers to lash out at their own fans, for the kind of bribery that takes place, for the pettiness, what do you think I tell amateur racers when they ask me about sim racing? What do you think those conversations look like? Do you honestly expect me to tell them that, yeah, it's a great hobby to get into? I think the hardest part, though, has been trying to explain to friends and just even my mom and dad what it is I used to do for a living and what I did as a hobby without sounding insane. You have to understand, most of my friends are tradesmen. They work construction. They work landscaping. One of my buddies is a trailer mechanic. And as for my parents, my dad's an HVAC tech, and my mom's just a high school librarian. These are people with simple jobs who go to work, they have their own little cliques at work, and they go home. It has been almost impossible to tell them the kind of things I've experienced at work on a daily basis, or just the stuff I've run across participating in my favorite hobby, without sounding completely insane. Further compounding this, and I hate to play this card, but as I've mentioned before on my channel, I've struggled with mental health issues around a decade ago, and some of the stories I've told my parents, I can easily see how they'd hear what their son has to say about what he did at work and think he's having some sort of episode. When a brand new PC shows up on your porch and your son takes it in the house and looks you dead in the eye and says, "This was a bribe for doing damage control on social media because my boss couldn't stop lipping off customers," what do you think my dad thinks when I say that to him? This is not something normal people deal with, and yet this is rampant in our favorite hobby. When I go to my friend's house and they say, "How's work on your site?" This is obviously a few years ago. And I say, "I got a legal threat sent to my employer." This is not a discussion they know how to have because it's fucking insane. When my dad goes to work at the U of A, he doesn't have stories of someone walking into the dean's office with a project they're proud to present to the dean, and the dean says, "Read a fucking book." Right? That doesn't happen. When my mom goes to work at Austin O'Brien High School, she doesn't come back with stories of someone making a snide comment on Twitter about losing a sports game and being contacted by a rival school saying it was slanderous. It is impossible for me to seek any sort of support about this just among my real life group of friends, because everything in this hobby right now is progressively getting more and more insane. And that's why I've taken to you guys and sharing this with you. Do whatever you want with this information.